Hey everyone, and welcome back to our SolidWorks for Beginners tutorial series. In the last video I gave a basic overview of sketching in SolidWorks. This one is going to be a bit more of a deep dive. I'll cover in more detail all the various sketch commands. You'll learn how to use sketch geometry commands like lines, circles, arcs, dimensions, which allow you to size and position those sketch elements, and relations, which allows you to set relations between the different sketch elements. These three things are the foundation of sketching in SolidWorks, and mastering them will allow you to get the most out of your part designs. With that, let's dive in. Alright, so let's start this by opening up a new part. I'm going to use my standard English template, so I'll be using inches. And I'll need to start a new sketch, and let's say I want to create a sketch in the top plane. So just like really any application, there's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. And to start a sketch, I have a few different ways I can do that. You can just click the sketch command, and that will bring up a selection asking you which plane do you want to start that sketch on. So I could click the top plane here, and that would start my sketch. I'm going to cancel that for now. I could also select my top plane first and then start a sketch. Or even one other way that even kind of saves a click is I could click my top plane and then go straight to the sketch command that I want to start with. So now it started my sketch and I am working with a line command right off the bat. So ultimately it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to show that there's a few different ways to start a sketch, and that SolidWorks is really intelligent in how it guides you through the process. So I'm going to hit escape to cancel this line command for now. And then I want to go up here and hover over the line command. It shows you that L is the hotkey for line command, so that is one way to start it. Before I actually start a line command, I want to point out that you'll notice this left-hand pane is actually set to the feature manager, showing the design tree. But watch what happens when I actually click the line command. It switches over to the property manager, and the property manager will always display whenever you're running a command in SolidWorks. And this allows you to kind of manage your settings of how you're going to run and actually use that command. So I'll circle back to this and go in a little bit more in depth, but for now let's just see what it looks like creating a line in SolidWorks. So the first thing you'll notice is that once I start the line command, I get this pencil icon, and there's actually a line symbol underneath that, as opposed to if I were to start a circle, it's showing me a circle underneath that pencil. It's just a quick way to know what you're actually working with when you run a command in SolidWorks. And then another thing you probably notice is that it's displaying the origin to me inside the sketch. And every sketch will display the origin of the part, and that just gives you something to start your sketch off of. And you notice as I move my cursor around, it's showing me these temporary construction lines, showing me the relationship of my cursor to other sketch geometry. So right here, if I leave my cursor there, you'll see that white symbol showing me a vertical relationship to that origin. And if I go over here, now it's showing me that my sketch start point is horizontal to the origin. And the symbol is white, so that tells me that it's not actually going to create that relation. So if I were to start my line here, now I'm seeing yellow symbols, and I see a coincident constraint or relationship, and I see a horizontal constraint. So that will tell me that my line, if I were to end my line right here, will be coincident to the origin and horizontal. So if I end that, it displays those relationships coincident to the origin, and the line is horizontal. And then you'll notice that my line command continues, and the next line segment has a start point, the same as the end point of my last line. And the line command will just kind of continue like this, where you can keep adding line segments to it. The way you can end this is I can double click, and that will end that line segment series, but it still has the line command going. So now I can start new line segments up here if I wanted to, and then again double click to end that. Or the other thing that you can do at any time is just hit the escape key, and that will end the line command altogether. So I'm going to delete some of these, and just real quick I want to show that that white vertical symbol will not actually create a relation. So if I drop a line like that, double click to end it, there is no relation between my start point and the origin. Again, I'm getting that symbol, but it's not actually going to create that relation. It's just showing me that it is vertical at that point. So if I go ahead and click on a line segment at any time, it displays this property manager again. There's a few different things in here that it'll show. It shows existing relations. It lets me know that it's underdefined, and again, we can see that by the blue color of the line. So if I click on this again, I can change this to a construction line, make it an infinite length line. I can change the parameters, although typically we're doing that with dimensions and relations, and then some other parameters. The most important things in here are going to be these relations, and then changing different sketch elements to construction. So if I click on this line does have some relations, and I can see those here. I can see that it's horizontal, like I said, and also coincident to the origin. If I wanted to make this line horizontal, I could come in here and I could add that relation here, so I could make that horizontal or vertical at any time. Here, I'll just make it horizontal, and you can see that it locks it horizontally. I could also select my origin and the end point of my line to make those two things vertical as well. And now this line is constrained horizontally, and also the endpoint is locked vertically to the origin. So another thing that's worth pointing out that I missed before, if I start a new line command here, if I create a line, you'll notice these yellow construction lines that appear, and this allows me to create some relations quickly as I create different lines. So I have a perpendicular constraint there, a collinear here. If I create a line off this direction, I can also take advantage of a parallel constraint that will be created automatically. So the line command is pretty flexible, and it allows you to create a lot of automatic constraints with it. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's just kind of clear everything, and I'm going to go back up to the command manager, and I'm going to click this drop down next to the line command, and that shows the center line and the midpoint line. And the center line is really just a line with this for construction property or option turned on in the property manager, the line insert command. So if I create a center line, probably the most common way to use it is like this, where if I end that center line command and then go back to a regular line command, and let's say I'm creating the profile for a revolve, I don't know, something like that. If I go to dimension this and I go to the center line, I can actually dimension to the diameter instead of the radius. So that can be useful sometimes if you're creating a revolve. Centerline is also useful for creating construction geometry to help with kind of the relationship between different features like I showed in the first video. So that real quick example again, if I create a rectangle and two holes and then I add a construction line like this and a construction line to the midpoint and then make this vertical, well now I have some relationships going on between the outer rectangle and these internal holes. So let's delete all of this, and then let's look at how this midpoint line works. So the way this is going to work is it's going to start with the midpoint selection first, and then you're going to select the endpoint out here. So if I end that, it creates that midpoint constraint to wherever you select first. So that can be kind of handy sometimes. Like you saw, you can also get to both of those commands through here. You can create your construction line or your center line by checking this on, and the midpoint line by checking this on. You could even have both on by coming in here and checking both on. And also while we're in here, I'll just show what this orientation option does. So if I wanted to create a line automatically with a horizontal relation, I could check this horizontal box right there, and then when I create a line, it doesn't allow me to create anything but a horizontal line. So same thing with the vertical, but then an angle, what you can do is actually input an angle. So if I want a line at a 45, I can enter my start point, and then that line will always be locked at a 45-degree angle. The last thing I want to point out with the line command, so if I start a new line here, and then I enter my first line segment, and I want to create a radius, a really quick way to do that is to go back to the endpoint of the line you just created, and then once you hover over that endpoint and start dragging away, it's going to create a radius from that. So it's a really quick, easy way to create a radius as you're sketching with lines. Alright, so let's move on to circles. So if I go up to the command manager, I can see the circle command here. If I click that, the circle command works by giving it a center point, and then the radius is defined afterwards. So just as simple as that to create a circle. There's also the perimeter circle, which in order to show how that works, what I'm going to do first is create a rough triangle here. And then if I click this perimeter circle, that's looking for 3 points to define the circle. So if I click the first line, a second line, and a third line, it's actually creating tangency to all 3 points in order to define the circle. So sketching with circles kind of introduce a few different types of relations that you can take advantage of. So if I draw two circles and then I draw a line, and let's draw it like that, and you can see I got that tangency constraint there. I'll double click to end that line, and then I'll click another line here, and that time I didn't get the tangency, so you can see it isn't locking that line tangent. When I select a line and a circle or something with a radius, it allows me to select this tangent relationship, and I can do the same thing for this side, and then now I have tangency defined between my two different circles. So the last thing I want to show with circles is the concentricity relationship. So if I create one circle and then I want to create another circle here, if I select two circles or two radiuses, it allows me to use this concentric relationship to snap those so that they're always concentric. So I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's a little bit more advanced, but there is a spline command which allows you to create kind of parabolic shapes using it. So if I start dropping some points, you can see it creates this curved line, and then I double click to end that. It creates this spline, and it gives these little handles or these arrows that allow you to kind of drag these around and get different shapes out of your spline by moving these different handles like that. Alright, so on to rectangles. So by default, the rectangle command is set to corner rectangles. So if I click my first corner and then my second corner. That will define a rectangle. And keep in mind with rectangles, for the most part, it's always going to be defined in a way that has a horizontal and vertical constraint defined by default. So I can resize this, but I can't change the angle of those things without breaking those constraints, and then the rectangle will get a little bit wonky. So keep that in mind when you're using the basic rectangle commands. If I go back up to the command manager and I select the center rectangle, that allows me to select a center point and then one of the corners of the rectangle to define it, and then it automatically drops into construction lines to help kind of keep that relationship of the rectangle defined. So the 3-point corner rectangle, this one allows you to create a rectangle that is not constrained horizontally and vertically. So this way it creates perpendicular and parallel constraints between the different lines of the rectangle, which can be useful if you're creating off-angle rectangle shapes. And then similarly, there is the 3-point center rectangle, which allows you to define a center point and then the edge and the third corner to create an off-angle center point rectangle. And then there's the parallelogram, which allows you to define 3 corners of a parallelogram like this, and that will create relationships with the 4 sides always parallel. So moving on to arcs, by default it has the center point arc as the default command. So if I create a center point arc, the first thing you do is give it a center point and then one end point of your arc and then the other end point like that. And you'll notice with the center point arc, sometimes it doesn't behave quite the way you want it to. So for example, sometimes it might kind of do this, where you have to kind of work your way around the other direction in order to get the arc to kind of behave the way you're wanting it to. The next arc command is the tangent arc, and what you can do here is the first point that you select on the tangent arc will actually create a tangency relationship to the sketch element that you're building it off of. So for example, if I create my tangent arc with the first point selecting the end point of that other arc, it will create a tangency to that arc. And then the last one is a 3-point arc, where you define the end points first, and then you select a point somewhere on that arc of where you want it defined. So for example, the way you might use that is if I had a line like this, and then I click a 3-point arc, I can select my endpoints, and then my last point, it would create a tangency to this line. So then there is the ellipse, which has a couple different options, but the basic one is a command where you define the center point of the ellipse, then one of the endpoints, and then you define your width like that to create an ellipse. You can also create a partial ellipse, which is really the same thing. So you create your center point, your end point, and define your width, but then it gives you the option similar to the arc to define the start and end point of that line. Then there's also parabola and conic ways to create different shaped lines. Obviously parabola or a conical line, I'm not going to cover that right now, but potentially in the future. So let's clear this out. Alright, now let's cover slots, which is a really useful sketch command. So the basic one is a straight slot where you'll define the 2 center points of the radiuses of the slot. So for example, if I started on the origin and I come over here, I've defined the length of my slot, and then I can click again to define the width or the radius of my slot. So I can also do a center point slot. If I create that, it'll first take the center point and then one of the end points of that slot, and then define your width like that. Then there's also the 3-point arc slot, so you're going to find the 2 end points and the middle point of that slot. So for example here, if I click one end point, the other end point, and then the center point, it allows me to create a slot at an arc like that. And then there's the center point arc slot, which, as you would expect, I define the center point of that radius, and then I define the start and end point of the slot and the width. Onto the Polygon command. So if I want to create a polygon, like a hexagon for the head of a bolt, for example, I can create that with this. By default, it's going to be a hexagon. I can change the number of faces of that polygon in that field. But the way that this works is it'll take a center point, and then you're going to define one of the corners of that polygon like this. Also, you'll notice that it allows me to set whether I want that to be an inscribed circle like this or a circumscribed. So there I just changed that option, so it changes that to a circumscribed polygon. So then we have the sketch fillet and the sketch chamfer command, and I consider these more editing tools than they are actual like sketch geometry or sketch entity commands, because in order to use it you need some existing geometry. And a really easy way to demonstrate this is to create a rectangle. A few different ways I can do that. If I start the sketch fillet command, what it's looking for is what entities do you want to create the fillet on, and obviously a fillet's going to go on the corner, so I can either select this corner or select the 2 lines like that to create it. I'm just going to delete this for now. And I also forgot to point out that it takes the radius input here. So right now it's set to 60 thousandths. So again, I can either create the fillet by selecting the two endpoints, selecting the corner intersection, or I can actually just click and drag to select those two corners, and it'll create a fillet on those like that. So if I complete this, you'll notice that it does maintain the constraint that I had to the origin before the fillet. So it took that corner or the endpoints of the line away. So it's no longer able to create a coincident between the origin and the two endpoints of my line. But what it did is it created an intersection and some geometry here on the fillet so that it could maintain the relation to the origin. It also automatically dimensions those fillets, and what's cool is that they're all set to equal. So everything I selected, I can now change or update that, and it will drive all four corners to be the same radius. So the sketch chamfer is very similar, but a little bit different. So with this, it allows you to define the chamfer in a couple different ways. So you can do angle distance, distance, and you can specify whether those distances are the same. So if I do angle and a distance, if I click the first line and the second line, it's going at that dimension and that angle. Now if I change this to be 0.25 and 30 degrees, and I click this line and that line, now it creates 0.25 for the first dimension, and it will dimension it based on your first selection and your second selection. It'll define it like this. So your first selection is where the chamfer dimension will live, if that makes sense. And then if I switch this back to distance, and I take off this equal distance check mark, I can enter two different distances there so that I can click the two lines. And again, my first selection will be the first dimension, and then the second selection will be the second dimension. So when I click this line, then that line, this first line will have a dimension of 0.25 on the chamfer, like that. Now let's talk about the trim command. So the trim command, or the trim entities command, can be used to clip out geometry out of your sketch. So really quick example of that is if I draw a tic-tac-toe board, something like this, I can grab this trim entities command, and by default it's on power trim. And what this does is it allows you to kind of click and drag your mouse like this, and anything that your mouse touches while you're holding the left mouse click button, it will be trimmed out. So if I drag across this line, it's going to trim that line entity away up until the point where it intersects some other geometry. So again, if I go like that, I can trim out all of this excess, and then I'm left with that polygon shape in the center there. So let's restart that, and I'm going to draw a rectangle and another thing like that. So let's say I want to trim out this line here to kind of create a U-shaped channel like this. Again, if I use the power trim, I can drag over that line, and now I have that U-shaped channel remaining. And notice that it leaves a red dot where I just trimmed out an entity. So if I hover back over that, I can actually undo that trim. So inside of the property manager of the trim command, there's a couple different options. Probably one of the more useful ones is the corner command. So again, if I drop another tic-tac-toe board like this, and then I go to my trim entities command, I can click on an entity here, and you'll notice it gives you kind of a preview. It highlights those two lines red, and that's going to show me what is going to remain. You'll notice when I clicked on the inside of those two lines, it left those two lines to the inside of that intersection. If I click on the outside of the intersection, it's going to leave the outside two segments of the line. I'm not going to go through anything else here, and to be honest, I really don't use anything but the trim or the power trim command. I think that the power trim alone really covers everything that you're going to need for basic trimming commands in SolidWorks. So if I drop down the trim entities command button here, you can also see the extend entities button, and I can just demonstrate that quickly. So if I click on this line, it's going to extend that until it intersects something. So you notice if I hover on the more to the right side of the line, it's going to extend that line until it intersects something over here. And if I hover over the left side of the line, it's going to extend that to the left like that. So I could extend those. To be honest though, for the most part, you can just do that. You know, once I drop that onto the corner, it's going to create that coincident constraint or that relation there. And that works just as well in my opinion. All right, now moving on to the convert entities command. In order to use the convert entities command, you need existing model geometry to convert into a new sketch. So real quick, I'm going to draw up a simple rectangular extrude. I'm just following the golden rule here. I'm going to fully define this quickly. So 2x4 inch square, or rectangle I should say. We'll extrude that 1 inch. Now I'm going to go normal to this face, and I'm going to start a new sketch. And I already have the face selected, so it starts a new sketch automatically. I'm going to draw a circle in here, and I'm going to make a tangent on that side, and then tangent on this side. Clicking the tangent relation there, and it looks like my tangency didn't create right away. I'm also going to right click, say select midpoint, and then select my circle and make that coincident. So now my circle is fully defined. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this face and click convert entities. And that's going to basically just copy the outside profile of that face that I selected and turn that into sketch geometry with a relation that actually defines the sketch entities based off of that face that I had selected. So you can see it's automatically fully defined. So now let's say I want to trim out these three faces. I click the power trim command and I'm going to trim out that side of the circle. So now I have this half round and I'm using the rectangle from the existing geometry to kind of create this profile here that I could again make an extrude off of to kind of build on my existing model, like this for example. And the nice thing about this, just like a lot of other things in SolidWorks, is if I go in here and I change this to a 3-inch width, I'm going to go normal 2, I'm going to complete the sketch. You can see that that circle is still centered and it's still using that model geometry from the convert entities command to keep that outside profile. Okay, now I want to talk about the smart dimension command in SolidWorks. And SolidWorks does have other dimension commands and other ways that you can dimension things, but to be honest, I think that the smart dimension covers probably 90 to 99% of situations that you might use when you're dimensioning your sketches. It is very smart, it's very intelligent, very intuitive, and it works great within SolidWorks. So like I mentioned before, typically in SolidWorks what we're doing is we're going to roughly sketch the profile that we want to create, and then we're going to come back and dimension it. So for example, if I drop in some lines like this, and let's say I want to create that profile, I would make my rough shape and then I'd come back and dimension this. When I start the smart dimension feature, you get that icon by the mouse to let you know you have a smart dimension started, and I can place dimensions a few different ways in here. So if I want to dimension from the top of the shape to the bottom, I could do two things here depending on my relationships. I could grab the top and the bottom like this. Let me just delete that quick. I could also grab another smart dimension here, and I could also grab just this line to dimension that distance. Because of the way that everything is constrained here or related here, that dimension is the same both ways, or it produces the same result. So you also notice that as I start dropping these dimensions, I get this heads up window that allows me to modify that dimension after I place it. So I could make this 2 inches at any time and it would drive that. So a lot of your dimensions are going to be linear like that. I could also dimension from point to point like this. Let's make that 1.5. So you could make really any point to point dimension that you want. I could go from point to point like this, and then what you'll see is that as I move my dimension around, it's going to intuitively kind of understand what relationship do I want to create. So this would be a vertical dimension, this would be a straight line distance dimension, and then this would be a horizontal dimension. Also, you'll notice when you select a horizontal line, for example, it's automatically creating a horizontal dimension. Same thing if I grabbed a vertical dimension here, it's automatically creating a vertical dimension. I can also place an angle dimension. Say I want this angle to be 45 degrees. If I click one line and then the line off at an angle, it allows me to dimension the included angle or the excluded angle over here. So if I drop that, enter 45 degrees, I can drive that to be 45 degrees. You notice I'm starting to create some relationships with all the different sketch elements. So let's say I want the distance from this line to that line to be 0.25. Enter it like that. And then let's say I want a hole over here. I can dimension this hole position by clicking on any feature and then clicking on the outside of the circle, and by default it will dimension to the center of a radius when you select a radius. And then enter my distance from the edge like this to be, let's say, 0.75. I hit escape, and then if I start a new dimension and I select the circle, by default it will give you a diameter dimension for full circles. Now let's say I change my mind and I actually want to make a 3-point arc from here to there, and then I'll use the power trim command to trim that out. So I'll change my profile a little bit. If I wanted to dimension this radius, by default, if it's not a full circle on a circular type profile, it's going to default to a radius. Then let's say I want this width to be 2 inches. So I can grab from line to line, make that 2 inches. Now you can see everything is really fully defined at this point except for my arc here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 2 points, and I can either go to my heads up command manager here to make those horizontal, or I can select that from my property manager over here. I'm still not fully defined, so a good way to check this is to just kind of click and drag whatever isn't defined to figure out what you need to do to fully constrain that. What I'm going to do in this case is make the center point of that radius coincident with this line. So coincident will put this radius on that line profile. So now we're fully defined. Another way that I could have dimensioned this arc, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense in this situation, but if I wanted to define the length of this arc, I could do that by clicking the one endpoint, then the other endpoint, and then the arc profile. That will allow me to dimension the length of that arc. So now again, everything is fully defined. All of my sketch features and my sketch elements are black in color, so I can tell that everything is fully defined. Now what I'm going to do is show you a common error that you'll very likely run across as you're using SolidWorks, and I'm going to drop another dimension here, and you can see that I get this warning. Some of the dimensions turn yellow, and that's letting me know that there's a conflict between some of my dimensions, or that it's overdefined. So what this says is adding this dimension will make the sketch overdefined or unable to solve. Do you want to add this as a driven dimension instead? So I could add this as a driven dimension, meaning that the other dimensions will create the output of this dimension. So I can't modify this dimension. It's only essentially like a read-only dimension. Or I could leave this dimension driving, which would produce all of the errors that it's previewing here. So I think for now I'm going to actually leave this dimension driving just to show the errors or what that looks like, or after you overdefine a sketch like this. So it's saying no solution found, item is unresolvable, item conflicts. So the yellow is item conflicts, red would mean that it's unsolvable. So that's telling me that right now that there's just conflicting dimensions and conflicting relations. So one thing that I could probably do to get rid of some of these conflicts is to delete a constraint, which did work. So if I hit undo there, let's see, I could also take away this angle dimension. So now the angle is actually defined by this distance. So if I wanted to change that angle, I could make this 4 inches, and now that would change that angle. So that's kind of showing how these conflicts can arise. I can't drive this to 45 degrees because that angle is driven by this dimension, and the combination of these three dimensions across the top kind of stacked together is defining this point and that point. So that's why it's not allowing me to drop that additional dimension. So there I actually made this a driven dimension. You can see it turns gray in color, letting me know that it's essentially a read-only dimension. So if I make this 3.75, you can see that it will change this angle, but I can't actually edit this dimension. So if I double click that dimension as if I were trying to edit it, it says the dimension selection is driven and its value cannot be changed. So for the most part, linear dimensions, diameters, radiuses, angles, and arcs should cover at least 90% of situations. There's one other really cool dimensioning trick that I want to show. So if I have 2 circles and I want to create a profile, something like this, and let's make this and this tangent, tangent over here, tangent here, and create tangency there. And then let's say I trim this out and I have kind of this off-kilter slot shape. If I were to grab this radius and this radius, it's going to dimension center to center on those 2 radiuses. And a lot of times that's what you want, but in some situations, if I hit escape twice there, it'll reset that. In some situations, you may want to dimension from the outside 2 points of those radiuses. So a really quick way to do that is if I start a new smart dimension and I click toward the end of my 2 radiuses, it will give me that outside to outside dimension. So I'm going to delete that. And one thing to notice here or be aware of is if I hold the shift key and I don't click near the outside tip of the circle or the radius, it won't actually grab the outside dimension. So in that case, I clicked way up here and it didn't grab that outside edge. Alright, that was a lot. We really covered a lot of ground there, but hopefully this gave you a really good understanding of sketching in SolidWorks. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future tutorials where I'll be diving deeper into how to turn these sketches into 3D models using features. I also have a lot of other videos on the channel that are great for engineers, so be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.